Hi, everyone. My name is Misha Klopukh. I'm a researcher over at the MPCR Laboratory, Machine Perception and Cognitive Robotics Laboratory here at FAU. And I'd like to talk to you about something that's a rather personal issue that I've come across many times throughout my research and throughout helping some other people who come by my lab and who come by our lab in their research. And that's the problem of small data. Here in this field, right, machine learning, AI, statistical modeling, all this stuff, we call it big data for a reason. And that reason is we rely on thousands to millions of data points just for our models to get any kind of representation of the real world. There's a lot of use cases that really don't provide such huge amounts of data. Off the top of my head, human subjects research, biomedical data, scientific data, you're looking at chemicals, physics, astronomy, and economic data and geographical data, geopolitical data, where things change so slowly that the next time you're going to have a major event is in 100 years or something like that. And with that kind of data, we can't collect huge amounts of data. We can't collect millions of data points to run these kinds of processes. But the data we do collect is far more complicated than the traditional techniques that we learned can really get everything out of. So we can still use machine learning to process it. And for that, we have special techniques for small data sets. First of all, I have to go over this quick disclaimer. And I know it sounds obvious, but you should always check your basic techniques first. I don't know how many times I've run into this problem or people I've been working with have run into this problem where machine learning does everything. And when you're a hammer, everything else looks like a nail. So it's a common tendency for us to go straight for, let's put machine learning in this. How can AI help us when in reality, we can use simple statistical techniques? It'll save you weeks, and I speak from experience, weeks, months, just by trying these simple things first. Always follow Occam's razor. A simpler solution is probably a much better one. All right, with that out of the way, let's get to our first important technique. Data augmentation is probably one of the oldest techniques that we've been using to handle small data and even not so small data. Data augmentation is probably found in almost everyone's machine learning pipeline. It's built into many libraries. This is wonderful because, for instance, in PyTorch, which is my library of choice, all you have to do to add data augmentation is say torchvision.transforms.compose, and then whatever your transforms are. Transform.random resized crop, or crop to a certain size, resize, add noise, normalize, unnormalize, do a bunch of random things like random flip, which can often multiply your data by like 4 times, 10 times. And this can be very helpful, once again, if you've got a small data set, but still a rather representative one. Most of the time, this is used for images, but there's also solutions for other data types, which I'm going to get into a specific case right next. Important thing to note, there is a caveat here, which is when you have a lot of data, but not necessarily a representative sample, your data set will not cover all of the different edge cases, even with augmentation. So augmentation, while it will help increase the size of your data set, it won't increase the amount of things that it will represent. But here's a simple thing that I've tried. My personal case was automatic chord recognition, and I was working with a student at the university doing this, where we wanted to recognize chords played on audio from a guitar. We wanted to use spectrograms. Spectrograms are a nice visual representation of audio data, where you take sort of frequency on one axis and time on the other axis, and you sort of get this picture with different motions. And problem with this is it's really hard to get a large data set on this to label it, because frankly, it's time consuming. And if you're undergraduate students, it's not the kind of thing you want to spend your weekends doing. But even professionals, I mean, no one likes to label data by hand. So Image augmentation, though, does not work the traditional way, because if we randomly resize or crop these images, we can often crop out important pieces of information, or we can move to a different place in the frequency domain, which would mean we were having a different chord because it's a different frequency. So that's not quite going to work. But there are solutions. For instance, Google came out with this technology called Spec-Augment, and Spec-Augment, published in this arXiv paper linked here, was designed for speech recognition, and it creates these augmented spectrogram images by adding masking at different points and time warping only on the time axis various sections of the data. This was able to significantly improve our accuracy on chord recognition and has helped us to essentially complete that project where we were able to classify different chords from audio. The next technique I wanted to talk to you about a little bit is pre-training or fine-tuning. Fine-tuning, pre-training is very commonly used, and it's the whole idea that you take a pre-trained network, right? You take a neural network that you trained on some other problem, be it ImageNet or LibreVoc, which is a voice data set, or various other types of data, and you just want to train the last layers on your new task, or you want to train the first and last layers, or you can even update the entire network, up to you, depending on your constraints. There's various advantages to choosing either one. For instance, if you have a very small data set and a very large network, by training the entire thing, you're very likely to overfit. But by only training a last layer and having a specific set-in-stone feature extractor, you're actually still only using the representation available in that last layer, but you have all of the information from the features. One of the beautiful things about pre-training is that we can pull trained models from various large data sets out there on the internet. Good resources for this include PyTorch Hub, which is rather new, and Model Zoo. And these have already these networks that have been trained for days, and you can take advantage of really well-defined features on various different data sets. Another sort of side benefit of pre-training is that if you have some kind of rush, if you have a hurry, you can train a pre-trained network, you can fine-tune it in a matter of hours, minutes even. So it's very easy that way to make simple demonstrations, which is my next case example. Demonstrations are significantly underrated. We don't talk enough about how important it is and how much of a different problem it is to demonstrate a technique versus to actually make a real implementation. But we still need to do it, and oftentimes you need deadlines. So this was a project where we needed to demonstrate recyclable goods recognition using deep neural networks for implementation, say, in a recycling or waste management facility. So unfortunately, no one's going to let you into a waste management facility with a camera to sit your camera up and take a video for an hour without any kind of demonstration of your technology and any kind of agreements and stuff like that. So we had to go and we had to collect data ourselves. Now, it's hard to find trash. You probably have a bit of it lying around in your home, but you're not going to get millions of images of trash. And you're not going to get it off the internet. So what we did was we took a couple hundred images of trash and we trained a pre-trained ResNet from PyTorch Torch Vision, which is built into the library. And that's a pre-trained network on ImageNet. And we can readily take less than 100 samples per class across 5 classes and get over 96% accuracy, which, albeit not impressive from a machine learning standpoint, if you're trying to show a complete stranger of the merits of your technique, this can be a really, really effective way to do that. And so this is beautiful because it generalizes readily. I mean, these features are really well defined because they've got days and days of pre-training. And so you can easily show it brand new data and it still classifies accurately. But sometimes this is actually a rather impractical task because every once in a while you have a data type that nobody's really pre-trained a giant neural network on. So you might want to try to create a custom subtask. Sometimes it's an unsupervised task. You might want to do clustering or some kind of translational task. And the advantage of this is, say you have a lot of data, a huge data set, and you only have about a couple hundred labeled points, though. For instance, cloud data or protein data or atmospheric data. And this is something that allows you to have functionality similar to pre-training, but you don't have a pre-existing task. So you're going to have to create your own. I'd like to bring up a case study, which is not my own case, but this is a case of someone I've had the pleasure of working with, Paul Morris. And Paul was trying to complete virtual high throughput screening, which is this idea that you can examine these large swaths of data from chemical screening assays without actually running the experiments in a physical wet lab. And you can predict things like binding. So this specific study, he was trying to predict binding to HIV, I believe. And you pull all this data from PubChem, which is publicly accessible data, but you really only have a couple hundred samples that will actually bind. So what Paul did, which is a good idea, it's a really interesting idea, was to pre-train embeddings, a transformer that converts the SMILE representation of a chemical, which is one way of representing it in text, to the IUPAC name of the chemical, which is another text representation. And both of these representations sort of describe the structure of the chemical in different ways. So by training a transformer, you develop embeddings that actually contain some semblance of the structure in order to convert between the two representations. And this allows him to take advantage of 83 million molecules in this PubChem database. And it significantly outperforms the networks that he was able to train directly on SMILE strings. Another subject that I find particularly interesting in how to deal with small data is conditional GANs. Conditional GANs are a different type of network which rely on image-to-image translation. A famous implementation is known as PIX-to-PIX, picture-to-picture. And these work with 200 training samples just as well as they work with a couple thousand, more or less. Note when I say reliably, there's a bit of a caveat. GANs are notoriously finicky and will not necessarily actually converge on any training. They require a lot of tuning of hyperparameters, but it's still much better than having to deal with regular classifier networks when you don't have the proper data. A couple of advantages are they don't require strong labels. GANs can be weakly labeled. GANs can have even labels that don't match, such as CycleGAN, which handles conversion from one representation to another in image format without actually having pairs. Conditional GANs, on the other hand, take a paired image. They take an input image and a paired output image and want to match the output image. And a lot of problems, despite this different way of thinking about it, a lot of problems can be reworked to fit GANs. Here's an example of a problem which I worked on. We were trying to detect tooltips, surgery tooltips, in order to detect errors in robotic surgery. And the problem is, it's very hard to get public data on this with real participants or even with simulations because it's just not something that's readily available. So we took some public data and we used this conditional GAN to convert from the image of the surgery itself as taken by the surgical robot camera into the tooltip mask. So essentially a white blob where the tooltip is. And this required less than 200 sample images, and it worked remarkably well. We were able to use classical techniques to reduce this tooltip mask into an actual position, and we can even use additional techniques to compare collisions. A beautiful thing about conditional GANs is there are three-dimensional versions of these where we can actually take 3D data and we can predict position. For instance, we can even take an image and hallucinate a stereo image, which allows us to get 3D information using classical algorithms. And it's amazing that this works on multiple patients. We only were able to train this on a single session, but it does work. We had some sample data on other patients, although there are some errors. So ultimately, this brings me to a big point. I believe that our job as data scientists is not to discover new techniques for manipulating data, but rather to discover new techniques for getting data into the old technique format. Because let's be honest, these machine learning techniques have been around for 30 years, and we're just now taking advantage of them. So the solution is usually to deliver the data in the right form. For instance, with the surgical robot, we didn't want to actually go straight to a question of where is the tooltip XY coordinates. Rather, we want to go to a question of how do we mask the tooltip. For the VHTS, virtual high throughput screening, the question was not do these bind, but rather what is their structure? Can we embed their structure? And for the trash, the question is not what does it look like, but given a set of features that are pre-trained from AlexNet or from ResNet 18 or from something else trained on ImageNet, can we determine what it actually is? And so it's all about manipulating the types of data, and we need to find ways of converting the data from the way we're given it into the proper questions. I think that's about all for me. Do you have any questions? I'm available in the text chat, I suppose.